Okay, great. Up next, we have Brad joining us, who is a professor of experimental psychology at UCL, fellow at the Alan Turing Institute and at Ellis. His research centers around human learning and decision making, integrating behavioral, computational, and neuroscience perspectives. And I'm really excited to hear how representational alignment connects to all the facets of those. So, welcome, Brad, please.
Is it like that 2 minute of plans or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I mean, first, thanks so much to the organizers for putting on such a terrific event, both scientifically and socially. So yeah, I enjoyed Iris's talk before, and like Iris, I'm interested in alignment of models with brain response. For example, taking a cognitive model of learning and fitting it to behavior and seeing how that aligns with brain response, and even done some work considering how these more correlative approaches might break down, and maybe instead we should do kind of a substitution direct interface approach where we think a brain region corresponds to a model layer. We should replace the model activity with brain activity and see if we could drive the computation forward. But I'm not going to talk about this more neuro model alignment issues today because Iris did a really good job of that. And instead, I'm going to focus in the first part of the talk on looking at behavior and getting very large embeddings from human similarity judgments and seeing how well deep learning models align with that human representations. And the second part of the talk is going to be a little bit more radical. I'm going to suggest that looking at alignment is not just a way of evaluation, but it might be a way people actually learn by aligning, for example, different embeddings for different modalities like vision and linguistic embedding. And I'm going to use the example of how children learn new words or concepts to try to motivate that. Okay, so going to the first part of the talk, there's been a lot of work that's been discussed too in the previous talk about getting large-scale embeddings from behavior. So here's an example from Martin Hubert's work, working with this things database of 1,854 objects and 1.5 similarity ratings to get this embedding of images based on human judgments. And I'm going to show you some work going more than an order of magnitude larger to 50,000 images. So this is the entire ImageNet validation set. And we're going to do it with a fraction of the human ratings, only around 400,000 instead of 1.5 million. And I'll show you what made that work. But first, let me show you the task from the human participants' perspective. They were shown 9 images on the screen at once, and were asked to click on which 2 images were most similar to the central image. So maybe they would click on the bottle on the bottom right and the coffee dispenser below the center image. So human participants did a number of trials like that. And the magic that made it all work, why we were able to scale to 50,000 images to build an embedding based on human similarity judgments, was we set up the embedding as basically a probability distribution. We used variational Bayesian inference. So the position of each photo in this embedding was somewhat uncertain. And instead of just naively asking people similarity judgments, we used an active learning procedure to minimize that uncertainty. And so that probably made the procedure more than 100 times more efficient for data collection. So doing some other tricks like ensembles, we were able to get this huge embedding space without tons and tons of judgments. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. So I actually removed a slide here showing a data analysis based on just the raw data itself, the triplets, because yeah, it's not just a uniform sampling of the ratings, but the whole goal here is to get an embedding that kind of from human judgments that reflects their understanding and all the mutual constraints across these 50,000 images. So yeah, so it's funny. I didn't want to go on and on about that because I usually start off with some analysis of but yeah, very astute. Yeah, so we're going to look at a bunch of deep learning models, and you're all familiar with these models. Image comes in one net, and usually a label comes out the other end. Often they're trained end to end through gradient descent. And so what we could do is we could show all 50,000 images one at a time to these models, get a pattern activity off like the penultimate layer, and see how similar each image is to each other image. Since we could get a 50,000 by 50,000 similarity matrix for each model. And then just as Iris was describing, we could get a similarity matrix, from the human embedding, because we have all 50,000 images from the human judgments in the space, and we could get a similarity matrix there. So we have a human 50,000 by 50,000 similarity matrix of all these images. For each model, we have a 50,000 by 50,000 similarity matrix. We could just correlate them to do, basically an RSA. So here are the results, and the alignment between humans' judgment and these models' representations is not that high. So it's like 0.27 for a relatively ancient model by deep learning standards, VGG 16. And you can see as you consider some more modern models that are better from the engineering perspective, the alignment, the correlation with the human embedding does not really increase. In some cases, it becomes orthogonal, like with this Inception ResNet V2, or this deep cluster model on the bottom, which is actually designed just to capture image similarity as opposed to classify objects. Likewise, post-publication, we ran this newer model, the SimClear model. That's an unsupervised or contrastive model, and it does not also align very well with human judgment. So in this part of the talk, really focused on this sort of technical enhancement of using variational inference and active learning or sampling to scale to get this huge embedding, and found that better performing deep learning models from an engineering perspective were not more human aligned. And so I started thinking from this project, well, can this say anything about how the brain represents information? And this is very early days, but one observation Brett Rhodes and I made is that if you look at the embeddings you get from work like Martin Hubert's things work, there tend to be a large number of dimensions relatively. So I think in his there was 40 some, and they tend to be interpretable. So you could just see here on the left, this would be fairly interpretable. You could look at the dimensions and you could see basically what it is and linguistically label each one. Whereas in ours, we didn't have this these constraints that James discussed earlier, like non-negativity. And we got this very compact, curvy, manifold type representation, incredibly low dimensional, but there's tons of information packed in there, and it's only interpretable in patches. So you might have one part of the space dealing with size and another part dealing with size in different patches. And so we started thinking maybe there's a trade-off between representing things in an interpretable way versus this unconstrained way like we did here. So again, mentioned that in other fields, like just looking at text embeddings generally, people have happened onto this non-negativity constraint and sparsity constraint to get the interpretable dimensions, which we didn't use ourselves. And in our own resimulations of our data and others, we find actually the non-negative part seems to be really critical to making these interpretable dimensions. Anyway, so getting at this idea of an encoding versus decoding trade-off, what I'm showing you here is a plot of how well unconstrained model in red, like ours, would do with some held out data, similarity judgments from the data I just showed you, versus one with this non-negativity constraint. So here, lower is better. It's this categorical cross entropy loss. And first thing it jumps out is that the unconstrained model does way better at encoding. It's just lower across all dimensionalities, which are shown on the horizontal axis. So if we look at the decoding end, though, and we look at sort of the best dimensionality from the encoding perspective, circled there is this kind of trade-off. So even though the model in blue, this non-negative model, isn't as good on the left, because lower is better there at encoding the information, you could read out better from it. So what we did here is it's all cross-validated. We showed an image of a cat, and we had this decoder, linear decoder, and is it a cat or not, basically? Is it a car or not? And can you read out basically from that representation? And even though that model in blue, that's with the non-negative constraint, doesn't encode as well, it decodes better. So this is just early, but we kind of excited about thinking these different kinds of representations and what they're good for. So maybe this relates to Elia's point of not just looking at alignment, but what are you gonna do with these representations? Okay, so now I want to move on to the second part of the talk, which I think is more of a departure and a little bit more radical. So everything so far we've heard about alignment a lot of it has been about evaluating alignment, between a model and a brain response, and an artificial agent and a human. Instead, maybe humans learn by aligning spaces. And this is a different view of learning. So, you're probably familiar with Quine's GABA guy thought experiment. where a rabbit's hopping across the field and someone screams gavagai, and does that refer to the rabbit, the hopping, a part of the rabbit, a blade of grass, the whole scene? And so that's a very difficult induction problem, but what I'm talking about is like another level, more difficult in principle. So just to illustrate it, imagine a child is listening to the radio and looking out the window at the same time. So listening to the radio, he's building up an embedding of linguistic knowledge. Looking out the window, he's building up a visual embedding of this visual information, but they're completely unrelated. And so what I'm saying, there might be a way to actually align the two and kind of know what everything is or what everything's label is without supervision. So that seems completely absurd and insane, but if you think about the feedback children get during development, it's not so crazy because a lot of it is asynchronous. So you often don't have, a giraffe and then someone says giraffe. I mean, it happens, but not as often as you think. So I'll talk about this paper a bit later, but Karina made this lovely figure that I think might give you the intuition what's going on. And it's this really kind of, ideas about how this might relate to replay that are out there. So imagine this little girl starting at the top left panel, already knows what a zebra is for Americans, a gorilla, a monkey, and she's watching this nature documentary. And sorry, she knows what a giraffe is, not a zebra. So zebras are hooved mammals. They eat leaves and grass. They are found in parts of Africa. They're hunted by leopards and lions. Okay, and then she gets bored after learning what a zebra is, and she starts playing with her toys, turning her back to the television in the panel on the top right. But she could still hear it, and she hears in the description of a copy that's very similar to zebras and giraffes. The description: they're hooved mammals. They eat leaves. They are closely related to giraffes, And so she could place this word, a copy, in her linguistic space, but she has no idea what it really looks like because she hasn't seen it because she's playing with her toys. Now she goes to the zoo in the bottom here. It's an exciting day for this little girl. And she already knows what a giraffe is. She already knows what a zebra is, but she sees this strange thing, which turns out to be the copy. She has no idea like what it is because she's never seen this before. But when she's sleeping, she has a copy now in her visual embedding space. And she realizes, oh, it's very similar to a giraffe and a zebra. And this description I got before of a copy is also very similar to a giraffe and a zebra. So she could, infer, align this linguistic and visual modality and basically know what this thing is without any supervision. So that's the claim that this is possible in principle and what children do. So first, let's see if it's possible in principle, like before we get into what children do. So here's some earlier work we did with Brett Rhodes. And the idea was maybe learning isn't like this event-based learning, whether supervised and unsupervised, where you have like a picture of a fox and the label fox and so forth. Maybe you can get an embedding from linguistic information shown in red there. And then maybe you could get a separate embedding from visual information shown in blue there. And our hypothesis is that the role object plays in one system is repeated in the other system. So for example, rabbits and squirrels are visually similar to each other, but we talk about them in similar ways too. Like the rabbit ate this, the squirrel ate that, the rabbit, ran over, moved there, the squirrel moved over there. So not exactly the same way, and they don't look exactly the same, but the idea is there might be a unique similarity signature in one system to all the other items that's recapitulated in the other. And if so, it should be possible to align the two systems without supervision. So how this would work with similarity matrices, like these RSA matrices we've considered, is that you'd have a similarity matrix for one domain, say up top in blue for vision. And in the bottom, we have a similarity matrix for another system, say a linguistic system. And if we had some hypotheses shown here by these lines going between the systems about how things corresponded, we could rearrange the rows of the bottom similarity matrix to reflect those mappings between the two systems. And here on the far left, that's a very bad mapping, because if we take the correlation of those two similarity matrices, which we call the alignment score, it's actually negative. But in the middle, we get a kind of more sensible mapping between these two systems. And now the correlation goes up to 0.48. And if you kind of get better yet, mapping between the two systems, this correlation or alignment score goes up to 0.85. So maybe it's possible if we could do a search on this alignment score to maximize it, we could figure out what everything is without supervision. And it turns out in principle that is possible. So we got these embeddings for text and image, text and audio, image and audio. And what I'm showing you here on the horizontal axis is the alignment score, this correlation between the two systems. On the vertical axis is the mapping accuracy between the two systems. And so you see as the alignment score increases, going left to right, the mapping accuracy goes up. The true mapping is shown by this little X in each case. And so what's going on in these red regions here for text audio and image audio, those are cases where this doesn't work perfectly, where these are incorrect mappings that have a higher alignment score than the correct alignment score. So if you were somehow able to search through and find the best alignment, you would make some mistakes basically, which isn't true in the text image case for some reason. So there's just noise in the embedding spaces, or maybe there isn't a perfect alignment. So just breaking down this text image one, I want to show you that there's a more is less, a more is more sort of effect here. So if we look at the text image mapping and we only look at 10 concepts on the left, you can see there's this huge red region. And that's because with only 10 concepts, there really isn't a unique signature in each system as to like what role it plays. And it makes it harder to map between the two systems. But as you go to 30, 100, 300, you can see it cleans up. And then basically each object has a unique role within its system that's repeated in the other system that allows the mapping. So this is kind of a more is better sort of scenario. And that also extends to the number of systems. So instead of just mapping two systems at once, we can map multiple systems at once. And this is just showing when you map 3 systems, you get a boost in performance, especially when you have a low number of concepts. So you could leverage constraints basically across multiple systems. We think of it as like each system's like different view on underlying reality, and you paste them all together, you could kind of triangulate what's really going on across these different modalities. Okay, so back to development. What does this have to do with development? I mean, it seems kind of far-fetched that you could just put everything together, but I think like the photo example I showed with the little girl going to the zoo, I think you could guess one new thing at a time if you were a kid by aligning systems. And so that's kind of what we're going to pursue in this study, looking at children's early concepts called early AOA, age of acquisition. And one hypothesis is that if they're doing this kind of alignment, the things children learn should be readily aligned, like more than chance. They should form a nice alignable system. And if that's true, and it is, then we want to see what distinguishes these early concepts that children learn structurally, like in terms of how they're arranged, or if you do a graph analyses, how are they different than just a random sampling of concepts? And can we take those kind of statistics that distinguish them, children's early concepts, and build learning agents that use the same factors? Can we make agents that learn efficiently doing that? Okay, so the idea here again is we're going to do a mapping between two systems, like a visual system and a linguistic system. We might already know things like what a car is, like what an apple is, what a banana is. And if we see something like this truck there on the upper left, we know it's visually similar to the car, and we know the word truck. We hear it like, I drove the truck, I'm in the truck has tires, the car has tires. We know that this word truck is linguistically similar to car, and so we might be able to guess that the picture of the truck is called truck and not a pear, because pears are discussed in a very different way than trucks in language. Okay, so that's essentially what we're going to do, is a kind of forced choice. So given these agents that we're using the model children, given their current knowledge, which is just the mappings they know between linguistic and visual space, can they do these forced choice tasks? So we say, is the train, called train, or is it called airplane? Okay, so it's just going to be this forced choice. Is this going to be above chance? Okay, so what we do to calculate when these agents make a decision, is we just look at the alignment score. So if you call the airplane an airplane versus a train, what's the alignment score? Including that new concept with all the existing ones. What's the correlation between the two systems versus if you did the incorrect mapping? Okay, so it's not going to be 100% because there's noise and this and that. But if this hypothesis is correct, it should be above chance. The correct mapping should have a higher alignment score than the incorrect mapping. So you should be able basically to guess what things are without supervision. And we're going to simulate these agents based on the concepts children learn. So we use this word bank data set of 8,300 children. And this is just showing the number of new concepts they learn per month from month 16 to 24 based on their parental report. And the first two agents we're going to consider are one AOA agent. So this is modeled on just the samples, just like how children sample concepts. So this agent is as likely to add, dog to its knowledge base at the same time a child is going to add a dog. So it's sampling, so they're all a little different, each agent, but it's basically just trying to mimic the kind of concepts children learn at the same time span. We're going to compare it to this red agent here, this control agent that just randomly samples concepts. We want to see if the AOA agent is better at doing this guessing task, and also if it forms a more readily aligned systems. So let's just look at the blue and the red here. So this is simulating across months of development from month 16 to 24. So kids know more concepts, their knowledge base grows across those months. And the vertical axis here is just forced choice performance. And like, is it an airplane or train, basically? And so you can see the blue line for the agent that matches children's knowledge over time is much higher. So it's performing much better at this forced choice task than this kind of random control agent in red here. But both are doing really well. So even the control agent, it's amazing what you could do by alignment. It's above 80% in this forced choice task, where this more developmentally motivated agent, the AOA agent, is at like almost 90%. And that's true too if you test on concepts that aren't acquired early by children. Those are harder, but you still get this nice result. Okay, so you might be thinking now, just a really quick aside, I got these embeddings from like the linguistic embeddings, GloVe embeddings from adult speech. Like, why don't you use child-directed speech? If you do that, you get the same result. But we're not going to focus on these. I could get into why. Basically, there's just so little data. It's like millions of words versus billions of words. There's tons of noise in these embeddings and the child embedding, and it doesn't correlate any better with itself than it does with an adult embedding. And I could tell you some thoughts about that why, but we're just going to focus on the adult embedding. Okay, so we took these concepts, the early ones kids learn versus the later ones, and we want to see structurally what delineates the kind of knowledge bases you get from the sets of concepts children have versus just random sets. And I won't go through all of these, but what it comes down to is kids' knowledge bases tend to be really dense and interconnected, much more so than a random sampling. And we thought, well, why would that matter computationally? And it turns out, I mentioned noise and embeddings, that there's a ton of noise if you just reinitialize these embeddings, like these linguistic embeddings, and run them again. And the stability of where things are relative to each other really falls off for things that aren't very connected, that are far away. And the embeddings, that's what this is showing here, as the inter-concept distance increases across in an embedding, the less reliable, basically the placement is of these concepts of similarity. And so you can't really do alignment if you have a ton of noise in your embedding. And so it might be, if kids are doing this alignment, that they're preferring these kind of samples that are tight and interconnected because they best support alignment, just computationally, because human learners will suffer from noise too. Okay, so using these statistics that we got that distinguish children's early concepts from random sets, we thought, can we build agents that don't necessarily learn what children do, but follow the statistics children do? And in one case, optimize the statistics. So we're going to make one agent that just tries to mimic the statistics of children's concepts, but might not actually learn concepts children do, but just kind of gets their statistical structure. Another agent that can tune these statistics optimally, so kind of upweight and downweight them. Okay, so the AOA matched agent is the one that tries to mimic the statistics of children, whereas the task optimized one tunes itself. And I won't go into the details, but it's in this paper. And so what's shown here in black is the sort of mimicking agent that isn't necessarily learning the concepts children are, but are mimicking the statistics of children's concepts. And you can see it's enough to pretty much match and maybe even surpass their performance a bit, whereas the task optimized agent that could selectively weight to increase performance does a little bit better, which isn't surprising. So we can make agents that don't learn things children learn necessarily, that are very effective just by kind of copying children's abstract strategies in terms of the kinds of knowledge bases they like to create. And this is just showing that these agents in black and gold here, these ones that aren't yoked to the children's concepts, they don't actually just learn early concepts children do. So it's good. So they're not just learning exactly what children are learning. So in blue, that's the agent that mimics children. It's of course at 100%. It's only learning early AOA concepts. Whereas the agent in black here, you can see by the end of learning that we're modeling, it's only about half the concepts, it's learning our early concepts that children learn. So it's these agents are fairly general in what they learn. Okay, and final result from these agents I want to show you is this is like just getting at what do they actually learn. So what we did is we took all the concepts and we got superordinate categories for them, higher level categories, and we calculated the entropy over them. So we could see basically how diffuse across domains the knowledge was acquired by these different agents. And up top, the highest entropy one, so the most diverse, was in red. This is the random agent, which makes sense. If you're just kind of randomly sampling, you're going to get a little bit of everything, so high entropy. Whereas in gold, this task optimized agent, you can see is highly focused. So it kind of took what children were doing and getting this dense interconnected neighborhoods and just took it to the next level. Whereas kids, or the agent that most closely mimics them in blue, is sort of this moderate entropy. So what I think is going on here is that kids have to learn certain things just to get through their days. Like they have to know what a fork is or what bedtime is or something. So there's probably some divergence from the task optimized agent just because there's pressures on them to learn certain things in their environment. All right. Okay, so just some summary of these developmental simulations. The hypothesis was that if children learn by doing this unsupervised alignment of entire systems, this is a very different way of viewing learning. It's asynchronous. It's not event-driven. If they do this, then their early concepts should readily align. And we found that they're distinguished structurally children's early concepts from being densely packed and interconnected. And that might have a computational advantage for kids because it leads to more reliable embeddings, which would in turn, of course, support this alignment. When we made agents that followed these same statistics, they were very fast learners. So they didn't just learn what children learn, they learned other categories, but they followed the same kind of recipe statistically, abstractly, and they worked very well, much better than control agents that just added knowledge randomly. Okay, so I just want to end discussing, I won't go into the detail because I've already presented too much information, but you might be thinking this is all great, but you haven't really brought anything into the laboratory and tested it experimentally. And so we wanted to see if we could bring, human adults into the lab and put them in a task where you didn't have to do alignment and see if people still spontaneously did alignment. So this is like a paired associate learning task where people had to figure out which each of these little monsters lived, which house they lived in. And these monsters varied on 2 dimensions, the color and the tilt of their eye. And there's these 2 spatial dimensions to the houses. And some conditions were alignable between the sort of monster representations and the spatial representations. And when they were alignable, people learned faster and could do 0-shot generalization to novel monsters, guessing where they would live. And we modeled this using a model based on CycleGAN that would basically learn a mapping in both directions. And that model characterized humans' performance the best, even when the systems weren't aligned. So it really looks like by default, people try to align representational systems, even when you don't have to, because it's just supervised. You could just not do that. Okay, so summing up the entire talk, at first, I talked about comparing behavior and models and getting these huge embeddings from human judgments using variational Bayesian inference and active learning, and showing that, well, these embeddings don't really track very well what's going on, or deep learning models don't really track what's going on very well in this human embedding. And it looks like as the models are getting better from an engineering perspective, they're not getting more human aligned. And the second part of the talk is really like a departure. It was still involving behavior, but it was just really asking, instead of just using alignment to evaluate how well representations line up, maybe humans learn by trying to align things. And we found some evidence of that. That first we showed it's possible. Our environment is structured that way, that in principle, you could align different domains. So information in one system like visual is repeated in linguistic systems. And Ilya talked a bit about that too with GPT-4. But we also showed that it looks like kids do that. It looks like kids form readily aligned systems of their early concepts. It looks like there's advantages of that in terms of overcoming noise and forming embeddings. And if you take the kind of statistics that the children are relying on, you can make agents that also perform well. So I think it's exciting because it's like complementary. It doesn't replace all the learning work we do, but it's another complementary way of looking at learning. And maybe it's something that goes on when we're sleeping. Maybe we're figuring out how to align these different representations we have in our head to have good priors for like what is what even before we encounter it. Okay, so I want to acknowledge Brett Rhodes and Karina, who's just finishing up her PhD, who did all the work. And just thank you and take any questions if there's time.